A long, 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 long time ago, the Roman Empire was the mightiest empire in the world. You might say that it filled the same role that the United States does today. Nobody wants to cross us. Nobody wanted to cross the Roman Empire. At least ways nobody who wanted to last. In this mighty empire was born our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. In this empire, the Christian church was planted, took root, and grew. In the 300s, the church was finally made legal, and a generation later, it was actually made the official state or empire religion. The Christian faith continued to spread, but the Roman Empire did not. As is the case with all empires and nations, decay and weakness set in. To the north were wild and crazy tribes that liked to do nothing better than to conquer and pillage and burn and all sorts of fun things like that. And they attacked and they conquered the Roman Empire, at least in the west. In the eastern part of the empire, it survived for another 5 centuries or so. Civilization, at least as it was understood in the Roman Empire, came to an end. But there was one shining light, the Christian church. And throughout the West, there were these little outposts of Christianity that were called monasteries. The monks were men who had left the comforts of home to serve the Lord. And in a sea of paganism, they brought the light of Christ. As it was in the pagan Roman Empire, so now it was among the pagan Goths and Visigoths and Franks and so forth. They were conquered by the Christ child. Each of these invading hordes in succession became Christians. Not surprisingly, these monasteries developed an active and vibrant worship life. In fact, how many of you are familiar with the services of Matins and Vespers? They are right out of the medieval monastery worship life. Due to their commitment to Christ and their desire to worship Him, the monasteries had to keep 2 other things alive and well. One of them was literacy, and the other was music. Keeping those elements alive, if you happen to live near a monastery, you would often hear the voices of the monks singing their praises, lifting over the walls of their compound. Now, in order to keep literacy alive, they developed the practice of copying books. Makes sense, doesn't it? And they would copy anything that they felt had value. This is how, to this day, we have the ancient histories from Livy and Herodotus and people like that. But what they really liked to copy were religious books, Christian books. And what could be more Christian than the Bible? So they copied the Bible. And I'm not talking on a Xerox machine. I'm talking about hand copying, which would take forever. And one of the wonderful things about that from the point of view of the monks, I mean, if you're hand copying the whole Bible, you begin to become an expert in the Bible. They knew their Bible. Now, one of these monks, and we don't know who it was, noticed all these wonderful names for Jesus in the Old Testament. And so he actually composed a poem based on these wonderful names drawn out of the Old Testament, and he added to it other things, to the name other things that related to the name drawn from the Bible. Now, we don't know who this monk was, And we don't even know when he did it. All we really know is that it happened before the 9th century. And we know it happened before the 9th century because in the 9th century, it seems to have started to be used all over in the monasteries. The poem is called today the O Antiphons, and you can find a copy of it in your hymnal right next to O Come, Emmanuel. And what they used to do, they were very big into the Psalms, by the way, and you know how we use an antiphon? They would use one of the O Antiphons each day for the week leading up to Christmas attached to the psalm that they were using for the day. The poem becomes the background for our hymn, O Come, Emmanuel. In the 19th century, a man named Neale translated the poem into English. And so the church instantly got a Christmas carol or hymn that was both ancient and modern. Though technically an Advent hymn, in America, this hymn is most closely associated with Christmas. And why shouldn't it be? Christmas is the celebration of the fulfillment of all of those Old Testament promises. Emmanuel has come. He has ransomed us. He has opened wide our heavenly home. He has freed us from Satan's tyranny. He has closed the path to misery. So, we, with believers from all the centuries before us, continue to rejoice. Emmanuel has come, and we celebrate by singing, O come, Emmanuel.
One word there. The music will start with an introduction piece, brief, and then it'll go into the hymn.
Now, one way, going the wrong way. Boy. Here we go. Most people in America take singing Christmas carols for granted. You hear it all over the radio. You hear it in the shopping malls. What is Christmas without music? I mean, if you never heard Silent Night or O Come, Emmanuel during the Christmas season, you would probably wonder what black hole you had fallen into. And this is certainly true for us Lutherans. Singing just is part of the Lutheran DNA. In fact, some of our earliest Christmas carols, like From Heaven Above to Earth I Come, were written by none other than Martin Luther himself. So it may come as a bit of a surprise to you to hear that for the English-speaking world, singing Christmas carols is something rather new. In fact, not until the 19th century did Christmas carols become a common feature in the English-speaking world. Because England had been influenced by a man named John Calvin, and for Calvin, the only proper music in a Christian worship service were songs that were taken from the songbook of the Bible. That is the book of Psalms. So that's what they sang. And everything else was just too worldly. The hymns that we will sing next, the hymn we sing next, While Shepherds Watch Their Flocks by Night, was destined to break the dike and let the English-speaking world begin to sing not only Christmas carols, but hymns in general. It is the work of none other than the poet laureate of England, Nahum Tate, who got the position in 1692. Tate was the son and grandson of preachers, and so everybody was trying to steer him towards becoming a pastor. Personally, I think it's a noble profession, but he didn't want to have anything to do with it. He wanted to be a writer. And so that's what he did. And he wrote books and plays and poetry and you name it. But after becoming England's official poet, he obviously focused mainly on poetry. And his first attempts at religious poetry was about a reversification of the book of Psalms, which is what everybody did, and that's how you got approval, and that's how you got put in the hymn books. You reworked the Psalms. But he did something a little bit unusual. He did the Psalms, but then he didn't stop. He went to the rest of the Bible, and he just got stuck on the Christmas story in Luke, especially the story about the shepherds. Because the shepherds was a story about ordinary people putting their faith into practice. And he pondered that, and finally he wrote his poem. And he knew there was no way that this was going to get published. There was no way it was going to get approved, but he still worked until he got what he wanted. Now, as the poet laureate, of course, and him reworking the Psalms, he did get to turn in all his Psalms to the official committee that checked everything out, and he slipped in his little poem about the shepherds and the angel. Well, it couldn't have been more shocking than if he had versified Aesop's fables and put it in there. How in the world could you write a song, a Christian song, and not base it on the Psalms? It just wasn't done. But there was a problem. It was good. And the committee looked at it, and they examined it every which way they could, and all they could say was, this is good. So, he probably mixed up the stories and have shepherds and wise men at the stable at the same time. Nope. He stayed with what the Bible had. Well, maybe he brought in extra ideas. Nope. He stayed with what the Bible had. And he did it well. He did it good. Well, it wasn't the Psalms. That's true. And that would have been enough to keep it out, actually, except that he was also the poet laureate, which meant he had the approval of Queen Anne. And they didn't want to get on the bad side of Queen Anne. There was still this nagging problem. Okay, we're going to put it in, and we'll see what happens. And everybody liked it. The Queen liked it. The people liked it. But they didn't sing it. They didn't sing it. They sung the Psalms. But eventually it began to get sung. Now here was something odd. Okay, you decide we can at least ways now have non-psalm songs. That is, as long as Tate writes them. Because nobody else can be as moved by the Holy Spirit as the poet laureate Tate. And so while Tate does this, it takes 70 years for the next non-psalm song to get approved in the Anglican Church. And 80 years, sorry. And that would be Angels from the Realms of Glory. And then it would take another 70 years after that for the next song to get approved. But by then, they started approving them pretty regularly. And they were scared because, let's face it, people might start writing songs about, I don't know, Christmas trees. And say, oh, Christmas tree, and then they want to sing it in the church. Or something silly like that. They might do a song about a hymn about roasting chestnuts on an open fire and want to sing that in church. So, they were scared. I guess they had some ground. But they were also keeping out Silent Night, Oh, Little Town of Bethlehem, Angels from the Realms of Glory, real Christian songs. And when the floodgates finally opened in the 1800s, England finally started giving us some wonderful hymns. While shepherds watch their flocks at night might seem like an unlikely candidate today to start a musical revolution in the church, it did. And because of that, many of our best loved Christmas songs are now in any English hymnal you can find. So let's go ahead and join in singing while shepherds watch their flocks by night. It was a particularly cold winter in the Austrian Alps in 1818. Joseph Franz Mohr was the assistant pastor at St. Nicholas in the town of Obendorf. Mohr was gifted in the area of music and so was in charge of the church's music program. Franz Gruber was the church's organist. He was also a school teacher and lived in the neighboring village. As both loved music, they became fast friends and would often spend their evenings singing, either by a guitar or by the organ music. Mohr had planned his Christmas Eve midnight mass very carefully, right down to the last detail, when disaster struck. The organ failed. Try as he might, he simply could not get the instrument working again. What was he to do? How could they celebrate the midnight mass on Christmas Eve if there was no music? And the day this happened was December 23. There was just no way possible for them to get a man up there to repair the organ in time for the Christmas Eve midnight service. And just then he received word that he was needed as the priest. One of his parishioners had given birth. Now, in those days, women didn't go to the hospitals to have their babies. They had them at home. And in those days, when they still had not perfected all of the medical marvels that they had today, children often died. And the graveyards that you went to had plenty of little headstones commemorating the fact that children, even infants, had died and were buried. So they really rushed their priests and pastors over there very quickly so that they could baptize the infants just in case the unthinkable happened. By the time he was finished with his duties, night had fallen. Through the snow, he trudged under a star-filled sky, marveling at the mystery of birth and the mystery of the incarnation. As he was going home, suddenly he remembered a 6-stanza poem he had written 2 years earlier. Excuse me if I butcher the German here. Stille Nacht, Heiligen Nacht. When Mohr got home, he searched for his poem and he found it. After a few short hours of sleep, he rose early and traveled over to his friend Gruber's home. Sharing his dilemma with his friend, no organ, no music, he wondered, could he compose some music on the guitar for this poem of his? Gruber looked it over and thought, yeah, I could do that. And so later that day, just a few hours really before the midnight mass service, Gruber shows up with the music for Silent Night, Holy Night. And they ran over it and it worked. And the choir that didn't know the organ was busted had showed up. And so he rehearsed the choir. The children sang the last 2 stanzas in 4-part harmony, and the first part of the verse was done in unison voice. And within an hour or so, it was ready. The service started, and Silent Night, Holy Night made its debut on a guitar. That would have been the end of Silent Night, Holy Night, because this was just a small Tyrolean village. They didn't have email or all the stuff that we have today to let this wonderful hymn get out. But what happened a couple of weeks later is that Karl Mühlrocker arrived in town to repair the organ. And as often is the case, they need to test the organ to make sure that it was okay. And Karl asked Pastor, says, you were telling me about this hymn that you guys sang. You got the music for that? And he said, well, sure. So he pulled down the music for Silent Night, and Karl played it. And he liked it. Now, Karl was a busy man. Organs do tend to break down. And as he went around through the various Tyrolean villages, repairing organs or installing new organs, he would play Silent Night. And as he played it, all these other little villages started saying, that's a great song. Why don't we get the words and we can sing it each Christmas as well? And so that's what was happening. And that would have been the end of the hymn. It would have been a regional favorite in the Tyrolean villages, except for something else. You see, Austria has a tremendous history of folk singers. To this day, probably the best folk singing groups come from this area of the world. They have festivals and all that kind of stuff. And many of these folk groups are really families. And back in the 1800s, these families would travel around from town to town, and they would sing, put on a few concerts, and oftentimes they had other little specialties as well. So in 1832, the Strasser family came to a town where Karl had recently installed a brand new organ. Now, the Strasser family, aside from singers, they actually made gloves, so they would sell gloves and they would put on concerts. And while they were in this town, the people in the village were playing and singing Silent Night. And they said, wow, that's great. And so they got the words and music to Silent Night, and they decided to incorporate it in their program, which was going to take place in Leipzig in just a few weeks. And they were going to bring this brand new Christmas song that nobody ever heard of. And guess who was at that concert? The King of Prussia. And he was blown away by Silent Night, Holy Night. And he said, we got to have that at the National Cathedral for our Christmas Eve midnight Mass service. And of course, when the king is going to be at the worship service, guess who else shows up? Everybody. And so there they are in the worship service, and Silent Night comes on. And now not only the king is impressed, but everybody in the Austrian-Germany area becomes a big hit. And from there it starts to spread across Europe. And before you know it, people in France and Italy are singing it. But you know where they're not singing it yet? They're not singing it across the pond. They're not singing it in America. But do you know any American that doesn't know this hymn? Yeah. How did that happen? It was another folk singing group. Like I said, Austria is known for their folk singers. And the Rainiers were Austrian folk singing family, and they came to America in 1839. Remember that date, 1839. Round it, make it 1840 so it's easy to remember, okay? And they came and they put on concerts around the country, but especially they put on this one at Trinity Church in New York. Huge church, massive church. Now, I don't know how many times our Redeemer could fit in there, but let me tell you, it could, many times over. And they put on this concert, and it was packed, and they debuted in America Silent Night, Holy Night. the crowd was wowed. And all these people went back to their little churches, wherever they were, and they said, we've got to do this on Christmas. We've got to sing this song. And it spread like wildfire in the United States. Now, this is how fast it spread. 20, 25 years later. Now, that's not very long in the pre-telephone, pre-email, pre-everything age, right? 20, 25 years later, during the Civil War, they would take a break for Christmas. And the sides actually would get together and worship and have a Christmas celebration. And do you know what they sang? Only 20 or 25 years after the song gets brought to America, they sang Silent Night. The song had spread that fast. And why not? What a wonderful song it is. Today's Silent Night is the most recorded Christmas carol of all time. And it shows no sign of diminishing in its popularity. And so we will end today's service by singing Silent Night.